People are all over the ballpark about how they define prayer. My definition is really very broad, intentionally. I think prayer is simply communication with the absolute. And I would define the absolute, and I would ask people to define the absolute any way they want to. If this is our idea in this culture of God, that's fine. If it's the universe or Buddha or Allah, I think that's fine also. Also, people should decide what communication in prayer is. It may be using words, it may be silence, it may be meditation, but for me, prayer is a very broad and general category. Prayer can involve a religious aspect. It can involve going to church, synagogue, temple, and that sort of thing. For most people, prayer involves some sort of talking, but I want to go beyond that. You know, Father Thomas Merton was a famous Catholic priest who said once, "I pray by breathing." This sort of captures my idea about what prayer can be. It can be something that doesn't necessarily involve what you do. It's more how you be, how you are. And I think prayer can be so intrinsic and so natural that it goes beyond doing any specific activity. It can be so deeply ingrained in who we are that it's just a natural sort of process. The benefits of prayer, I think, fall into two types. First, there are physical benefits. This has been looked at by Dr. Herbert Benson at Harvard for more than 20 years. When people enter into a meditative and relaxed and prayerful frame of mind, the body responds with very healthful changes. The blood pressure comes down. The heart rate reduces. If you do it long enough and regularly enough, the cholesterol level will even fall. I think nobody questions this data these days. The body likes prayer. It responds positively to it. But beyond that, I think the evidence that prayer can result in material changes when you pray for me at a distance, even when I'm not even aware of it. There have been many studies that have been done through the years to really look at this. People who get prayed for who are in the hospital have a better clinical course, for instance. When people follow religious paths in their life, almost always involving prayer, they live longer. They get sick less often. They go to the doctor less. Prayer is materially good for people. It's good for the body. It's good for health. But if I may say so, I think the most majestic advantage of prayer goes beyond any of those things. Above all, prayer is a connection, a bridge to the absolute, whether we call that God, goddess, or something else. And prayer helps us understand our connection to something higher and something deeper and broader and richer than our small self. I cannot conceive of any greater benefit of prayer than this. I think it's terrific if people pray and they become healthier or a disease goes away, but I think the best benefit of prayer is that it connects us with something much greater than ourselves. Most people think that prayer in our culture is generally a good thing. It works either positively or it doesn't work at all. It's neutral. I think there's compelling evidence that prayer has a third possibility. It can be used for harm. You know, if you think about the ways this might come about, they're really not too subtle. Most of the wars going on currently in the world are being fought over religious ideas. And you have these idiotic situations, for instance, in Northern Ireland, where you have two Christian denominations that are praying the same prayer to the same God. Let me be victorious over my enemies. The conflicts in the Middle East and in Bosnia are religious conflicts. Prayer is heavily involved. People pray to be victorious, and every time there's a victor, there's got to be a loser. And when people pray for victory, whether they admit it or not, they're praying for death for other people and for devastation to happen. I think we really are naive about this. There is a mean side to prayer, and the way many people use prayer involves harm for other people. We need to give a lot more attention to this. I'll give you an example of a negative prayer. I recently met a woman who wanted more than anything in her life to be a writer. And she had tremendous talent. She would win every creative writing contest she entered, but she could get nothing published. All of the major publishers returned her work. This went on for over 10 years. She was so discouraged that one day, out of despair, she talked to her mother about this. Her mother said, "Darling, I know why you are not getting your work published. I've been praying that God gives you something else to do." And this woman said, "Mom, you mean you've been praying that I fail as a writer?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "Why have you done this?" The mother said, "Because I love you." You see, this is interesting because most of these negative prayers are done out of compassion and so-called love and caring. And so the woman said, "Mother, why have you been praying that I fail?" And the mother said, "Because writers tell things they shouldn't tell. Writers tell secrets." And so this mother was horrified that this daughter would write about family skeletons, incest, and alcoholism, and abuse. And she was terrified that this would become public. So she was praying that her own daughter fail in her task, her favorite task in life. Well, this is a negative prayer if you're on the receiving end of it. I'm sure the mother didn't think of it like this, but many of the prayers that people offer have a dark side to them. You know, prayer is back in medicine. It is becoming highly popular to research now. Let me give you an example. When the young medical students went back to school in the fall of 1996, they found that 11 of our first-rate medical schools had courses devoted to exploring spirituality and clinical practice. Many of these courses look at the data, the evidence supporting the effect of prayer. This is a historic landmark development in the course of Western medical science. Never before has this happened. Roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of our medical schools currently have courses in alternative medicine, so-called, integrative or complementary medicine. Many of these courses emphasize the evidence that prayer has a beneficial effect on health. So prayer is coming back into medicine after sitting on the sidelines for the better part of this century. I'm perfectly delighted by this because I think it shows that we can have a high-tech form of medicine that has a place in it for a spiritual component. And I think anything less than this is radically incomplete. I think a lot of people pray who don't have an ounce of spirituality about them, and I think a lot of people can be spiritual and not pray. So I don't think these things necessarily go together. But if you look at the major spiritual traditions in the world, all of them have had a revered place for prayer. Now, a lot of these kinds of prayers follow ritual and express nothing more than dogma and make people feel better and make them think they're more devout. And I think this is a lesser manifestation of prayer. But in its higher form, prayer can serve the bridges of helping people connect to the absolute, of really actually going beyond the religion itself. You know, prayer in its highest manifestation and expression tends to put religions out of business because it's a way of connecting personally with the absolute without going through any particular dogma, set of beliefs, or religion. The idea that prayer can be so negative that it actually might kill is a troubling idea which deserves more attention. If you look at some of the studies that have been done in laboratories, people have actually been able to harm living creatures, non-humans, but living creatures such as bacteria and fungi and yeast cells and even plants through their mental intentions. Now, a lot of people wouldn't want to call this prayer. They'd call it negative mental intentionality or something like that. But I suspect that people can do the same thing with prayer. You know, there was a custom in Hawaii that was very prevalent about 150 years ago called the death prayer. And according to this ritual, the shamans would gather together and pray to death someone on a distant island who was unaware this was being done to them. always the victim was causing a lot of social upset, and so the shamans would use this as a way to discipline or really eliminate this individual. And this worked. This is not classical voodoo, because in voodoo the victim is always informed that they're being hexed or cursed, but in the death prayer as it was worked out in Hawaii, the victim did not know. I suspect that this is alive and well in our culture, but we've become so accustomed to denying these effects that we really don't notice these things happening. People have forever tried to separate prayer and meditation, and I don't think this can be done so easily. You know, Dr. Benson at Harvard has looked at the responses in the human body that come about when people enter prayer or when they enter a state of meditation, and the body apparently can't tell the difference, whether you're meditating or whether you're praying. It likes both. It responds in a very healthy way. The blood pressure and heart rate come down and so on. So many people like to make these little rigid boxes between prayer and meditation, but I think that there's a tremendous crossover between the two. You know, there was a custom in Christianity many years ago called contemplation. It was a very common term. And if you look at the quietness and the states of silence that people who entered into contemplation were involved in, this is a dead ringer for many forms of meditation. So I think there's a tremendous crossover between prayer and meditation. There is a gradually increasing body of scientific evidence favoring the effect of prayer. This is very little known. Currently, there have been about 150 what we call controlled studies in hospitals and clinics and laboratories showing that prayer has an effect. Now, roughly 2/3 of these studies show that prayer packs a punch. It really does something, and you can prove this. And we're talking about statistical science here, where you have a control group that doesn't get prayed for, you have a treatment group that does receive the prayer, and you just simply see how they do. I would be the first to say, however, that prayer doesn't need science to validate it. I mean, the great believers throughout history in prayer, the great saints and mystics, haven't needed science to give prayer its blessing. They just simply pray. They know it works. But you know, in our culture, whether any of us like it or not, science is one of the most powerful factors in our lives. And if science says that prayer works, I think we ought to be able to get some mileage out of that. I think it's a good thing if we can get science together with spirituality. I think it's been horrible that we've kept them apart. It's created a lot of pain and suffering for individual people. You know, we've always been told in our educational institutions and universities and colleges that there are two ways you can live your life. You can choose to be scientific and rational and analytical, right? Or you can be spiritual and religious and flaky. And you cannot get those two impulses in you together. So you've got to choose which way you're going to live your life. If we were to take seriously this scientific evidence favoring prayer and the effect of spirituality in our lives, I think that this offers a terrific chance to bring science and spirituality together and to harmonize that need we have in ourselves to bring together the intellectual side of who we are together with the spiritual side. So I'm a big fan of bringing science and spirituality together, particularly in studying prayer. People have forever said that prayer has no effect of its own. If it appears to work, that's just because you thought it was going to work. You know, this is the old placebo response. The skeptics say that we're just looking at the effects of positive thinking, of suggestion and expectation. The scientific studies recently, however, that have examined prayer show that you can't explain it away by just saying it's a placebo effect. The reason is quite simple. The people in these experiments who are being prayed for don't know they're getting the prayer. So you can't say that they're thinking positively or they're expecting to get better because they don't know they're being prayed for. In addition, Most of these studies have been done on lower organisms, non-humans, such as the growth rates of bacteria, the germinating rate of seeds, and the healing rates of surgical wounds in cats and rats and mice and so on. So if these lower non-human organisms get better when they get prayed for, you can't say that this is a placebo effect. Presumably bacteria don't know how to think positively. If they grow faster when they're prayed for, this isn't due to expectation and suggestion. Skeptics and cynics are always saying that you can't talk about this prayer stuff too vigorously because it's just going to give people false hope. They're going to think they're going to get well, and when they get worse, they're going to feel as if they're a failure, and disease is bad enough. Let's don't make people feel guilty for being sick. I understand these objections, and I think they're a theoretical problem, but practically, I think that they're off base pretty much. You know, surveys have shown that in the United States, when people get sick, they do not stop using drugs and surgical procedures and just use prayer. Americans are pragmatic. They partner up, usually, they partner up alternative or complementary approaches to health care with orthodox medications and surgical procedures and so on. So I think the skeptics and the critics are really off base here. You can always find a few people who just try to wing it with prayer, and they're the worse off for it. But these are not common examples. Most people are just too practical minded. They do both. Many people have forever, throughout history, associated prayer with spiritual sites, religious sites that have power. I think that there really is a lot to be gained by following your own feelings and your inclinations and your emotions. You know, many of us need some aids and help along the way in our spiritual life and in our process of psychological and spiritual growth. And many people throughout history have just simply found that certain places are elevating, they're inspiring. And the reasons for this are quite unknown from a standpoint of science, but it is simply a fact that people honor certain places. They feel stronger, they feel more connected to the absolute and so on. And these places around the world tend to be on mountaintops, they tend to be in valleys, they tend to be by the seashore and so on. But it is a fact of human nature that certain places on the earth can contribute to a spiritual sense in human beings. One of the major dangers associated with prayer is using it like a pill. There was one spiritual teacher once who said that human beings have the habit of getting God mixed up with vitamins. And he was trying to say that it's possible to use prayer in such a practical and instrumental and utilitarian way that at a certain point you just can't tell it from penicillin. I mean, in the sense that you would take a pill to be healthier, you just pray because you just want some payback for your health. I think that if you use prayer this way and you do find that it helps, that's terrific. But using prayer in this way obscures the most major benefit from prayer, which is to connect us with the sense of something greater than we are, with the absolute, with God, Goddess, Allah, or whatever. So I think that we really have to be careful about how we use prayer. It can degenerate in just to such a practical, physically oriented use that we lose sight of the major benefits of prayer. I think that's one of the major side effects that we need to look out for. Most people think that you just pray when you're awake. I think that if you listen to people's stories, we have to enlarge this. Prayer can be done unconsciously as well as consciously. I'm convinced of this. The reason I am is because this is just consistent with people's experience. I have collected a great number of what I call healing dreams. And in these dreams, people pray. They dream that they are praying, and they're praying for a specific thing to happen. The most dramatic cases of these are when people pray for an illness to go away or a problem to go away, which they took to bed, and when they wake up after the dream prayer, it's resolved. Now, these are extraordinarily dramatic. They really ought to capture our attention. They tell us that it's possible for our unconscious to get in on the act of prayer, and that prayer need not be something we do totally in our waking, rational, aware mind. I love these dream prayers because they suggest that our unconscious is exceedingly wise. There's something about our unconscious mind that will come to our assistance even while we're asleep by engaging in prayer. I think these events of dream prayers really expand what we mean by prayer. Prayer has become so important in my life that I can't imagine my life working very well without it. I went for many years after leaving a religious life and growing up to becoming an agnostic for many, many years to returning to prayer recently. Prayer for me provides a sense of unity and oneness with everything there is. I feel that my life would be vacuous and empty and incomplete without that sense. I would not want to go back to not believing in prayer. Prayer has helped me unify a lot of things about my life. I used to believe that I had to park my intellectuality over here and my reason and my logic, and if I wanted to engage in spiritual stuff, you know, I had to pick up on another part of my mind. And I couldn't get those together. Through prayer, however, I have been able to bring those two parts of me together. My life is much more fulfilling and enriching to me personally since prayer has been integrated into my life than it ever was before. You know, one of the great pieces of instruction that runs through so many of the world's great religions is that we should become as a little child. And I think what is implied here is that there's a kind of simplicity and a level of trust and openness to what is that's embodied by children that we need to try to strive for that ourselves. You know, some of my best instructors in prayer have been children. I've gained a lot by talking to children about prayer and listening to what they think prayer is. I think we can learn a lot about prayer from children. You know, children don't have all of this intellectual indigestion that we adults have about whether prayer works and whether it can work or not. The children I've known who pray have an extreme amount of faith. They're not troubled by these doubts and so on that dog us adults. You know, they simply feel that it works. They feel they're connected to God, Goddess, and so on. And so they simply pray. I think there's a lesson there. People have been looking at different methods for centuries about how to pray. God knows we've been trying to find the formula forever. There have been two different strategies of prayer that have been looked at in the laboratory tests. One is called a directed way of prayer. The other is called a non-directed form. The directed prayer asks for something really specific. You pray for something definite, the heart attack to go away or cancer to be healed, that sort of thing. A non-directed prayer is open-ended. It simply is a "thy will be done" type of approach. It says simply, may the best thing happen in this situation. Well, the bottom line on the tests that compare these two strategies is, frankly, that they both work. They both work better, for instance, than not praying at all. So there's a benefit and a payoff to these prayers. There's a benefit and payoff to these different strategies of prayer. I like this a lot because it says very firmly that there is no one formula to prayer that everybody ought to use. We're on our own about this. We have to find out what form of prayer feels authentic and genuine and right for us. So I love these studies that show that both these styles of prayer work, because it really creates a huge spectrum that you can fit into depending on how you feel, what's right for you. I have asked a great many healers who follow various forms of healing in the culture about how they pray, whether or not they think prayer is involved in their particular technique. Whether you talk to hands-on healers, whether you talk to people who are doing therapeutic touch, healing touch, Reiki, and a great number of varieties of healing that are really becoming popular in our culture, most of these people will say that prayer in some form is quite important. It's uncommon to find one of these healers who says that prayer isn't involved. Now, I think the healers themselves are all over the ballpark about what they mean by prayer, but usually they invoke some higher level of information or wisdom. They're not trying to act as the source of the healing themselves. And you see, this is one of the functions of prayer, to put us in contact with this higher source and energy, or whatever we want to call this. So I think that's why prayer is so important and crucial in so many of these different healing methods. It helps us make contact with a power that's greater than ourselves, that can be used in whatever form of healing we're concerned with. One of the great questions surrounding prayer is whether or not more prayer is better. There is a school of thought that says that group prayer, or what's been called corporate prayer, is more effective than solitary individual prayer. The scientific studies that have been done to look at this, I think, are ambiguous. We really don't know, I think, all we need to know in order to say yes or no to this question. Since we don't know the answer to it, if I were really sick, I would get on as many prayer lists as I felt comfortable with. I would proceed along the lines of wanting to cover my bases, and I would ask everybody who cared anything about me and who could love me to pray for me. I would want more prayer than less prayer, personally. So what about the practical uses of prayer? You know, people pray for the strangest things. I recently had a letter from a woman who told me that she needed to come into some money to pay her debts. So she prayed to win the lottery. And she said, I don't want to win the whole thing. I just want enough to liquidate my debts. So after praying, one night in a dream, she saw the winning numbers. She went down to the lottery and entered the numbers, and she won precisely the amount to liquidate all of her debts. Where do we go with this? I mean, was this actual prayer, or was this what some people might want to call psychokinesis, or mind over matter, or precognition? There's a real murky boundary between all of these things. People pray to get the only remaining parking spot in downtown LA. I don't know how many people are simultaneously praying to get the last parking spot. But think about this. It's a blessing in disguise that all of those kinds of prayers are not answered. You imagine what would happen when everybody who was praying for the last parking spot got that prayer answered. They would all arrive at the same time. There'd be a massive crash. It's a blessing in disguise that all of those prayers for those physical things that seem so clear and valuable and needful to us are not answered. I've often thought that we ought to give prayers of gratitude, prayers of thanks sometimes for these unanswered prayers. C.S. Lewis said once, if God had answered all the silly prayers I've made in my life, where would I be now? Well, the value of prayer, to keep coming back to this, I think is not whether or not we win the lottery or whether we get the parking spot, and probably not whether the cancer goes away or the heart attack heals. I believe that there is some more majestic, valuable benefit to prayer than that. And to say it again, it's that way prayer has of connecting us with the absolute, of something greater than ourselves. You know, there's a benefit to prayer we don't ordinarily think about. In order for prayer to work, there seems to be some quality of our consciousness that has to get outside of ourselves. The fact that prayer could work at a distance suggests that we're not just confined to our brains and bodies. Consciousness is omnipresent. It's everywhere. There's no place that it cannot go. You see, these studies in prayer have shown that distance isn't a factor. Prayer works as well on the other side of the earth, is right up close. So something about us is beyond spatial confinement. This raises all sorts of hope of survival of death, of surviving the death of the physical body. It suggests the old idea of the soul, the fact that something about us is infinite in space and time, flows out of these experiments in intercessory prayer. So I think prayer raises the very real possibility of immortality, of eternality, of survival of death. So if we pray that our cancer heals and it doesn't and we die, we just may have to settle for immortality. It's not a bad consolation prize. I tried for many years to avoid coming to terms with prayer, and I did a pretty good job of it. I was your basic physically oriented physician for a long time. But you see physicians who really deal with sick and dying people see these cases from time to time where people have a horrible disease, they don't get treatment, they get prayed for, they should die, but they don't, and they live. I will never forget a patient I had who was an elderly man whose lungs were filled with cancer. And at this point in my life, I wouldn't have prayed for a patient of mine on a bet. I thought all of this stuff was fantasy and illusion. But this man was dying, and the only treatment he got in the hospital was that the congregation from his church came and prayed for him during every visiting hour. Well, I sent this man home to die because that's what he wanted me to do. And I forgot about him. I knew he was dead. Imagine my surprise when a year later I got a call from a physician who said, "You know, you need to drop by to see your old patient. He's back in the hospital with a bad case of the flu." So I went down to the radiology department and looked at his current chest x-ray and put it side by side with the old one, which was full of cancer, and the new one was entirely normal. And the report from the radiologist said, in the intervening 12 months, there's been a dramatic response of this patient to therapy. Well, the radiologist had assumed that I had given this man some super-duper chemotherapy drug, which had made the difference. I knew that the only treatment he had was prayer. This case tremendously troubled me. It bothered me a lot. I couldn't forget it. And I continued to bump into these kinds of cases periodically in my career as a physician. But I must say that, you know, we physicians have great ways of winning out of dealing with these kinds of cases. We just call them the spontaneous remission syndrome or the natural course of the disease. We will do anything to admit that the prayer might have done something. And so I drifted along like this, denying basically that prayer might work for a great many years until I bumped headlong into the scientific evidence showing that when you test prayer in a laboratory or a hospital, scientifically, it works. I became so convinced that the evidence for prayer was valid that I told myself, if you don't use prayer, you're withholding something that's really valuable from your patients. So I really got into an ethical quandary about this. And I got to the point where I knew I had to begin to use prayer because the evidence that it worked was so strong. So I reoriented my medical practice. I would begin every day by going to my office earlier than usual, and I invented a prayer ritual. It resembled nothing that I'd learned growing up, and I made it a ritual that fit for me. It felt right. I had accumulated a lot of shamanic rattles and paraphernalia that had been used by healers in various indigenous cultures. And so I would shake my rattles and I would burn incense, and I invented my own prayers for my patients I would be about to see in the hospital on rounds that morning, and I would pray for those who would come later that day. But never once did I pray for a specific sort of healing, because that didn't feel right to me. I wanted to tap into a higher wisdom, and so I simply prayed, "Thy will be done." May the best thing happen for these patients I'm about to interact with. I think that one ought to incorporate prayer into one's practice as a physician if one feels right about that. But I really don't want to tell other physicians how to do this, and I think you have to look inside and feel what's right for you. For me, doing something really different and organic, something that fit authentically and genuinely with who I am, was the way to go with this. The number of techniques that people have available these days for prayer are just immensely varied. There are hundreds of books on prayer. There are actual prayers that are available, such as the Oxford Book of Prayer and a beautiful book called Earth Prayers, that people can select prayers for different occasions, prayers for healing, prayers of gratitude, prayers of thanksgiving, prayers of protection, and so on. It has never been easier than it is today to tap into different ways of prayer. I don't want to be specific about how to pray. I think it's almost impossible not to bump into instructions about how to pray now. I'd like to see people in medicine begin to feel comfortable partnering up prayer with orthodox medicine. There's no sense in keeping these things apart. You know, for me, I just think this is a no-brainer. I think you ought to use what works. If you've got appendicitis, just to use a specific example, I think you ought to go have an appendectomy surgery, because this is the most effective treatment that has ever been devised for this particular problem. But while you're having your appendectomy, you should consider being prayed for too. The reason for that is that there are actual studies showing that prayer increases the healing rate of surgical wounds. You know, we get into trouble trying to put our eggs in one basket. We need to do different things. We need to bring these things in an integrated, harmonious way together. So I think the future is a coming together of high-tech medicine and prayer and spiritual approaches to healing. We need to get over this tendency just to separate these things. That has not worked. That has been very injurious for untold numbers of people. When I began to actually bring prayer back into my practice, it had a tremendous influence on how I felt. You know, every patient wants their doctor to be technically superb, and I think I did a good job that way. But the idea that your physician would actually do more than that, who would actually pray for you, I think tends to make patients extremely grateful to their physicians. I had a sense of attachment and a sense of unity and oneness with my patients after praying that I didn't have before. And I'm not sure how all of that works, but I think it has a lot to do with the healing powers and the unifying powers of compassion and love and empathy. We used to talk a lot in medicine about bedside manner until we got too embarrassed to use terms like that. But I think that prayer builds a bond between patients and physicians that is extremely powerful. I felt that after I began to pray for my patients. I have a strong tendency not to evangelize to my colleagues. And after I began to integrate prayer into my practice, I did not discuss with them my practice. Later on, I would write books about this, and this was my way of going out and telling my colleagues about my own experience and trying to describe the potential role that these things might have in their practice. But that's the way I prefer to do it. I think that evangelism is not a good idea here. I think that this is an extremely sensitive area, and if we want this to really progress in medicine, the worst thing we can try to do is sell it and push it onto other people. I think we present the data, we show the benefits, and then we back off, and we let other people decide whether or not it's right for them. Other methods have been tried, and it hasn't worked. In my own life, in my own interaction with my colleagues, I began to be most effective when I just decided to not try to push any of this on anybody. And it was at that point that my colleagues began to come forward and express a great interest in this.